How do you view delicious people? Broken record, I guess. So I am here going out of my way to finish up and catch up with this show finally. Season 3, episode 1, because there's only one that I can talk about. And because ultimately I would just be doing these two episodes and whatever, but like now I just actually have to just wait per episode. So ultimately we'll just wait till those come out. So within this episode, I think that we actually start to get some real, true, legitimate truth. But I also think that there is a lot, to me, quasi going on with this show, even though really there's just really and honestly, truly just two stories really to tell. So, going on into this episode, we ultimately have it to where we are showing uh, that Shadow Moon has gone, and it seems like we have to showcase that it's been quite a bit of time since the end of season 2 to go on to season 3, to where ultimately we have Shadow Moon who has some hair on his head, and ultimately to showcase that it's like, yeah, there's been some real time that has passed. Here's my thing though. Ultimately, like Shadow Moon being in prison, how exactly did he have a haircut to have his hair shaved bald? But now, all of a sudden, because ultimately, I don't know how many times like I've seen prison movies where people just have to grow their hair out because it's not like they're getting like barbers or whatever in prison. But I don't know. I guess it is what it is. But then also, I've kind of seen like prison like shows where they have barbers and anyway, it moot point. So we ultimately have it to where Shadow Moon is eventually full head of hair, and I'm like, is that a wig? Is it not a wig? I guess who really cares? But I don't know. It's just kind of a question. So, because ultimately it looks like one. It looks like a toupee. It does look like a toupee. Anyways, so we have it to where Laura is ultimately finding out that Mad Sweeney is, dead. So ultimately, she is going to the Baron in New Orleans, who is no longer there. And we have it to where the Baron's wife is talking to Laura, and we have it to where ultimately Laura is trying to understand like what she can do to try to get the leprechaun back to life, because ultimately she needs him to ultimately try to kill Mr. Wednesday, because that is now her goal. And we ultimately have it to where reasonably we have the Baron's wife just kind of telling her it's like, well, there's not much we can do. Ultimately, like he needs the ability to have power, and ultimately there's not much he can do. Ultimately, Avatar Laura is supposed to be drinking some concoction that is only made for her, evidently. I'm like, okay, well, what the heck is that for? Uh, that makes a whole lot of sense. It does. So we ultimately also have Shadow Moon, that is to be found out that he is this character called Mike. And Mike ultimately is a construction worker. And we have Mike, who is ultimately doing so well at this job that they are ultimately giving him a promotion. But with this promotion, is like, hey, well, we want a more concrete background check on you. I'm like, why wouldn't they have done that in the first place? I'm like, man, what is this weird construction working place that ultimately just hires people? Just, hey, yeah, you got an ID? Oh, well, good enough. And so And so recently now, since we've hired you and you've done really, really well, now we're going to background check you. So weird. So because ultimately Shadow Moon was talking to his supervisor, and ultimately he was thinking that they were going to let him go, but instead, like, oh no, like, hey, we're going to give you more pay, we're going to give you a better job, and ultimately we're going to give you a team and whatever, but ultimately we're just going to need to give you a little background check, which ultimately makes Shadow Moon just go, yeah, I need to get out of here. So they ultimately have it to where seemingly Shadow Moon vanishes to ultimately lead him back into seemingly Mr. Wednesday's arms, or in a arm of sorts. Because ultimately we have it to where Shadow Moon is trying to nicely walk an old lady across the street, and we eventually have it to where this old lady is talking a bunch of crap to Shadow Moon, talking about him being well endowed and all this kind of stuff that he knows that ultimately this old lady knows about Shadow Moon, because ultimately this old lady is actually Mr. Wednesday. So we ultimately have it to where Shadow Moon is confronted by Mr. Wednesday, and Shadow Moon doesn't really want to do anything that Mr. Wednesday wants. It's like, dude, hey, like I was on the run, and like, what were you doing? You were doing jack crap nothing. And ultimately, you've never really actually told me the truth. Like, who am I to you? What is my importance? Why haven't you really and actually and all truly told me that? And so recently, we eventually have Mr. Wednesday sit down with Shadow Moon and actually tell him the real, true, legitimate truth that Odin is actually Shadow Moon's father, and that ultimately Shadow Moon is asking, like, well, like, where were you? Like, why did you leave my mother? And ultimately, we have it to where Mr. Wednesday is like, well, I couldn't leave these shores. That's the problem when you happen to come to America and you're a god, and ultimately you can't just move anywhere. And ultimately his mother wanted to move anywhere, and recently this starts to kind of sound just like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 to me. Like it just kind of feels that like ultimately we have to where Olden just kind of like plops to woman to woman to woman to woman to woman, and ultimately at some point he'll still have a connection with some women, but recently it's just kind of really weird and or bizarre to eventually have Mr. Wednesday seemingly have a fiance, which I thought was just like, this feels like left field. Like all of a sudden just this girl shows up and Mr. Wednesday's like, yeah, she's my fiance. Hey, isn't that great? So we have it to where Laura is transitioning. So Shadow Moon knows that Mr. Wednesday is his father, and but ultimately Shadow Moon doesn't know that he has power, maybe. And so reasonably we have it to where Shadow Moon is ultimately just going and just like, God, I've like now I finally know like what my whole thing is with this war. Why was I involved? Because ultimately I'm Odin's son, and ultimately he's going to just take all of his children and just kind of kill them all off into this war. Is what we were naturally to assume is going to happen, to try and take out what is Mr. World now within this episode, because here we have yet another change. We ultimately have Mr. World, who is ultimately taking off his hat and taking off uh, his coat, to ultimately now be all of a sudden Miss World, which I'm like, wow, okay, all right. I probably should have seen this coming because ultimately IMDb was telling me eventually this stuff was quasi coming. But like ultimately, I just kind of wanted to play ignorant for I don't know how long. But because ultimately, I'd heard like ultimately on IMDb, they were already telling me somewhere in there that there was going to be a Miss World, I believe, in here somewhere. Um, I swear there was. Yeah, Miss World. Dominique Jackson. So ultimately, I had seen that in there, but ultimately, I had no never mind about it. That ultimately, I was just like, well, maybe it's gonna be like maybe it's just gonna be like, oh, he has a wife, and then ultimately that's just gonna just be a thing. Um, but no, it seems that Mr. World is now Mrs. World, and once Mrs. World just starts walking in, all of a sudden everybody's like, "Ooh, wow, this is great! This is amazing!" And we have to have Technical Boy's approval of Miss World coming in as well. So we have a tour, Mister. God dang it, Miss World. Ultimately, we have it to where now she is going and killing one of her minions, one of her people at her table, I guess to establish dominance, to say that she's a real threat. Because we ultimately have it to where, like, they were ultimately mentioning, which I thought was fascinating, the evolution of fear, which ultimately was mentioning how, like, people were spending, like, $3 on a pair of 3D glasses to ultimately, like, be frightened, how horror has come to be its own genre because ultimately everybody wants uh, to spend X amount of hours to feel uncomfortable or to feel scared and so on and so forth. And I kind of liked that. I kind of liked that interesting way of ultimately everybody ultimately everybody likes fear. It's just that uh, or ultimately wants to admit that they want to be afraid instead of being liked. Because ultimately, Mr. World had mentioned before that he's like, I would rather have people fear me than be liked. That like Odin is being liked by people. So like eventually we have Mr. World breaking down every little bit of the evolution of fear, how movies would create fear, how basically we would listen to the radio at one point and ultimately hear that there is an alien invasion happening. That ultimately, that old radio station that ultimately played War of the Worlds and ultimately never really told anybody that all this is reenacted. Um, that they thought that everything was really actually going on, and I remember that in hearing about that in some school somewhere, hearing about that old story where ultimately people were ultimately thought that there was a real invasion going on because a radio station was telling them so. And so reasonably they were everybody was getting freaked out. There was suicides and rioting and all kinds of crazy stuff happening because of a simple radio station that ultimately came on the radio one day and ultimately telling people that there was an alien invasion happening and they thought it was real because ultimately so many people relied on the radio compared to the TV. Uh, to eventually again, yeah, the evolution of fear where like people thought that everything was really done. Everybody thought that everything was really like a true story or whatever, and so I kind of liked this opening of this season. It was kind of visually really impressive. But ultimately, once we got into Mrs. World and she had to kill somebody to establish dominance, I'm like, this person means nothing to her. This person means nothing to Miss World. Why does she have to kill them to prove a point when ultimately seconds thereafter that she basically just defaced all of them? And so I just didn't quite understand why the whole scene with the table with having to kill some minion of hers. I just didn't get it. I thought it was stupid. I thought it was pointless. It's like we've had Mr. World for I don't know how long, just kind of just hooing in the shadows, not really exactly killing anybody, but all of a sudden now he has to. Well, he who is now a she has to get his hands dirty. I'm confused. But I guess it is what it is. So Shadow Moon, I guess to really showcase that that this Miss World is an actual actor, where Mr. World was just a guy that talks. Ooh, wow, that kind of really just like, yeah, we weren't gonna actually give that Mr. World guy anything to do because this Miss World, yeah, she's gonna get her hands dirty, and yeah, just I guess coming to the times. I guess I don't know. It's just really bizarre. So we go into here and have Technical Boy talking about, ooh yeah, Miss World. Ooh yeah, everybody has to be just excited about Miss World, and I'm like, why? So weird, so awkward, and nobody was like, oh wow, new media, wow, ooh wow. Nobody cared about any of the other new characters, aka new media. Uh, so why is it all of a sudden that they had to make a big deal about Miss World? I'm confused. Baffles me. So ultimately, we have to go into ultimately having. We have to have Laura, because now we're back to Laura. Laura is going to some grave site to ultimately have Leprechaun being resurrected, and ultimately we have it to where Laura pulls her coin out of her chest to give to the Leprechaun, but the coin ends up falling out of Leprechaun's hand, and ultimately while that is happening, Laura ends up dissolving onto the ground. Where ultimately she didn't take her elixir in time, I guess. So ultimately she just becomes this uh, cadavered mush, or ultimately she just becomes what I would be close to be saying is just almost close to ashes of sorts. So I'm like, oh wow. So in other words, is all of a sudden when Laura gets put back together, is she gonna become a different Laura? Is when this coin gets back into Mad Sweeney's hands, is he gonna be a different Mad Sweeney now? And so on and so forth. Reasonably, Mad Sweeney was just a dead corpse in this episode, and I was like, wow, like why did they even have to show this guy's face? It could have been anybody, and it could have been a statue of somebody, and it didn't have to have been actually Mad Sweeney actually being there because he was just a dead corpse the whole time. What was the point of that? But anyways, so we ultimately have it to where you ultimately have it to where Shadow Moon is going along with going along with Mr. Wednesday, and ultimately it seems that Shadow Moon meets Mr. Wednesday's fiance, and ultimately it seems that Shadow Moon goes on to leaving Mr. Wednesday to go on a bus of sorts. A bus of sorts that leads him to Wisconsin, that ultimately is like some lakeside. So we have it to where ultimately uh, Odin's fiance uh, throws Shadow Moon some hat, and to where ultimately once Shadow Moon gets off of this bus, we have him eventually holding this hat, and we have some drunk girls that come off of this bus, and one of them says like, "Oh hey, my friend really likes you," and I'm like, what was the point of that? It's like, yeah, so Shadow Moon is an attractive man, so you ultimately have to have some drunk girl like just throwing themselves at him because that matters? Whatever. So you ultimately have it to where Jack is ultimately on a journey to go someplace somewhere, and we ultimately have it to where uh, we ultimately have Michael, who is on his journey to go someplace somewhere to ultimately find this character called Whiskey Jack. Sure, just another god character that's a Native American god. I don't know, Zeus or Sess. So we ultimately have it uh, to where Michael is to end up going into this seemingly movie rental place, but it just kind of looks like almost like a very heavily like generic general store almost. But it seems to mostly have movies, and so Mike ultimately is to meet with and marry Hiselman, and so ultimately they are just talking about the town and ultimately how they have poor Wi-Fi. So ultimately that's the main reason why they have all the movies to be able to rent, and we ultimately have it to where it seems that Shadow Mode is ultimately asking if there's a taxi to get him somewhere, and that ultimately leads to where instead there seems to be some Chad Mulligan character that ultimately I know as being on Smallville and also being on Flash Gordon, that ultimately is going to conveniently give uh, Shadow Moon a ride. So we ultimately have it to where Shadow Moon uh, and Odin eventually meet back together to ultimately go to see this Native American god called Whiskey Jack. And ultimately, this is another one of these moments where I'm just like, what is the point of this conversation? What is the point of any of this? It seems like they are trying to get Whiskey Jack on their side, but ultimately, it's just another one of those moments where it's like, okay, this is not going to matter past this episode, so why should I even listen to any of this stuff? Because ultimately I'm just assessing that like, oh yeah, another god that ultimately is just going to last past this episode, and we're just going to be done with it. And so ultimately I'm assuming that this god is going to be just like Easter. It's going to be just like Argus. It's going to be just like so and so person, that ultimately you have this person here and he's not going to matter. And what is also the point of this story? Because I feel like any of this dialogue was ultimately just completely lost by me. Like all of this stuff, I was just like, okay, what is the point of any of this? I couldn't find a point, so ultimately I just kind of was like, okay, let's skip to the end, kind of thing. to ultimately we have it to where Odin and Mr. Wednesday are on this RV ultimately uh, to be driving their way to seemingly a police border that is ultimately going to stop them and pull them over. And we ultimately have it to where it seems that Odin is going to be using his magic to ultimately have this windshield be able to be a thing that uh, Shadow Moon can no longer see where he's driving to because he there's so much writing that is all over the RV. So we ultimately have it to where Shadow Moon is supposed to uh, do a hard right, and ultimately Shadow Moon is mentioning like, well, there's no road to do a hard right on, and so ultimately Shadow Moon's like, well, you'll know when to do this hard right. You'll know. And so eventually we have it to where Odin and Shadow Moon are doing this hard right to end somewhere. And that's the tail end of the episode. So I'm watching this and I'm just like, you know what? It just kind of feels like so much stuff is just kind of just like, hey, let's throw everything away. Let's throw everything, just throw everything away. Let's start all over again. Like, let's start getting all these people back into this war, and let's talk about all the war again. Let's talk about getting more people together in this war. We ultimately are having like Bilquist eventually within this episode, starting to see her her choices diminish on who she can pick from this dating app. And ultimately, it seems that Bilquist is ultimately mentioning that her and Shadow Moon's life are entwined, that ultimately they're going to be important eventually going into what is to happen next. And I'm just like, okay, sure. Try to make Bilquist important, but I'm trying to figure out like how is she important yet? How is she factored into this story besides her just seducing people and consuming people, and what else does she have besides that to offer this story? Is where I'm kind of looking into the future of things, just like, okay, where is this going? Does this matter? No. Well, then, like, it has to. I want everything to tie in, like, every episode to tie into one another, and it doesn't. And it frustrates the F out of me. And ultimately, I'm just, like, going, like, we have to tell, like, the smallest amount of stories possible to where ultimately an entire episode is just like, oh, hey, did you want this story to resolve? Well, F you, we're just going to go into this whole entire story about this person that you can't really care about, that ultimately is not going to have a real true impact on what is to go. And it feels like they are forcibly having to, like, oh, here's a new character. We gotta really set up this new character, and but then shortly thereafter that you're gonna forget about him. Like new media, like they had one episode to premiere this person, and then she was like quickly forgotten about until the very last episode. It's like, oh yeah, you remember this person, this new media that is now gonna like make Shadow Moon and everybody else on the run? Well, that's the only thing that she could do throughout all of these episodes because we have completely forgotten about her to where we ultimately have it to where, okay, like going into season 3, completely forgotten about again. And like there's so many characters that are now just completely forgotten about and swept under the rug. And like I'm assuming that they're never going to really have truly legitimately their time in the sun, and they're just going to be there. And I don't know, I'm just I'm just trying to just ultimately just justify these people, these characters. Where is like now I think we're telling smaller stories because the new Cove or the new normal Cove. So now we have to tell smaller stories, and yeah, it's just so I'm gonna get out of here. A little bit of frustration, but when looking at it, it is what it is. So I don't know. I'm like, I kind of liked where season two went and ended, but this episode, I'm just like, God, I'm more frustrated than anything. I'm just disappointed, and ultimately, I'm just like, I I'm feeling like they are just milking the crap out of this show. Just milk it all out. And that's the real frustration that I have. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.